Okay, so this is an open forum. This is an open forum. This is your session basically, and I want to open it to questions and hopefully collectively through the grace of God we can get answers. Yes, sir. Well, yeah. Well, here's what I would like to begin with. I will speak for a few minutes, give an intro of questioning in general. And then I have, as I mentioned to you, I have 24 questions that we grouped, or Bishoy and Sameh grouped for me into 4 categories. So I would like to cover the questions that you guys had submitted first, and then we can open it for others. Okay? Because your question may be one of those that was submitted, and I want to make sure I get the list of questions because there were quite a few of them. Okay. Briefly, I want to just mention something about questioning. It is very important for us to question. Questioning means that your mind is hungry in search for the answer, the truth. When your body is hungry, you gotta feed it in order for it to live. When your mind is hungry, you have to feed it in order for it to be nourished. Okay? So questioning is a good thing. But one thing I would like to, and this is something that if you're doing evangelism or if you're sharing your faith with others, when you are asked a question about your faith or about anything, what is your intuitive reaction? You're asked a question, what do you do? Huh? Answer what? Answer what? The question, right? When we are asked a question, you answer the question intuitively, quickly, blindly. But that's a mistake that we all fall into. We somehow divorce the question from the questioner. And we need not to answer the question, we need to answer the questioner. The person who's asking the question, because the person who's asking the question may be asking a different question than what you just heard. Do you get it? Okay. I get a question from one time. I get a question. What does the church say about suicide? You could say, oh, well, Saint so-and-so said that, and Saint so-and-so said that, and the scripture said that, and this said that, and this said that. But is this really the question he was asking? No. He actually had issues struggling with suicide himself. So the question was more existential than just, let me answer the question. No. Try to focus on the questioner and the perspective behind the question. Distinction. All right, now let's open it to some questions here, and then we'll get the discussion going with all of you. One of the question, of course, the most commonly heard question: if God exists, and if He's all powerful and all loving, then why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And I'm sure you've had these discussions. Bishoy mentioned that you talked about this so much. So I don't want to exhaust but we can maybe talk briefly. Why is there so much evil and suffering if God is all powerful and all loving? And why, if there's a God, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? Come on, this is you guys. It's your questions and your answers. Yeah.
Am I supposed to answer the question? Okay.
Please.
Well, my understanding of it so far is that this is the physical world, test of faith, of free will, of choice. Things like the Book of Job. Things like. Okay. I'm so sorry. Things like the Book of Job, which is in some way the idea of the counter arguments of faith in God and the idea of being grateful for existing at all are what teach us that. That's been my understanding of it. That suffering is here to let us know that that's what Christ came to come in the flesh to show us that He will suffer with us.
Very good. That's the kind of the spiritual Christian response to suffering, which is very, very good. Yes, Bishoy.
I mean, there are two kinds of evil, like natural evil and moral evil. And we kind of fall victim to each other as a result of moral evil being, decisions that people make in choosing, doing the wrong thing over the right thing. So crime, things of that nature, the moral wrongs. Why is there evil and suffering? We oftentimes blame God, even though God, through His love, gave us free will, and through that free will, we exercise it by doing wrong, and by doing wrong, we hurt each other. So
very good.
Suffering is a result, I guess, morally speaking, from the harm that we do to each other as a result of free will, which is given through love from God.
Excellent. So we misuse or abuse the gift that God has given us, the gift of free will. Very good. Well said. I like that it's very concise to the point. Yes, sir.
It's also
Go ahead. No, and then we'll go.
similar question, I guess. Like, we know that God is just, right? So I just don't get it why some people have to be born in faith and some people have not born in faith, and some people are just, we all have free will, but some people are in an environment where they have to commit a crime, or they have to steal, or they have to do anything illegal. They don't have an option. If I'm born like in an alcoholic family, my parents always don't go to church, or like always do bad things. So probably I'm just born seeing them, so I have no option technically. I have no free will, so that idea perplexes me.
Right. Well, how do you know that?
Sorry?
How do you know that you don't have free will?
I'm saying you do have free will, but you're kind of born seeing the environment does something, so you don't have much of an option.
How do you feel towards those people who are born in this environment and you don't know if they're going to go to heaven, they're going to go to hell, you don't know how God is going to
And not much of heaven or hell, but just in life in general. Some people are born in a good environment, they are going to church, they have good family, they have probably financially they're more equipped, and intellectually more equipped also. And then some other person doesn't have those luxuries, I guess.
Right.
So I just like that one of the things that perplexes me.
Good question, and very quickly.
Seeing that God is just, and
Yeah.
understand that God is just.
Very quickly, I would like Shinoda, one thing I would like to point out is that our standards and God's standards differ. So what you think is luxurious and wealthy and good and intellectual and all these things, with God's standards, He has a different measuring stick. Okay? What you may think is poverty, to God, this could be wealth. What you think is foolishness, to God, that could be wisdom. And St. Paul talked about this extensively. The wisdom of the world, wisdom of God, and St. James even talked about that. So we have two different standards by which we measure this versus that. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind. Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to continue on what you're saying. Bunadud Lamay once had a confession with one of his sons, and his son was asking him, Abuna, like when I go to and his son was doing like services and stuff with poor people, and every time I do the services, I feel like how am I supposed to go to heaven? I mean, I see all these people go to all these sufferings, and they have the right, they have the ownership of going to heaven because they went through the suffering. How can I, the one who has all these luxuries, expect me to go to heaven? So it makes me think, what is the meaning of life? And basically, I came up to one really answer. If you could eat, if you have shelter, then you sustain life. So really, it doesn't really matter on the fact that you have a job, or the fact is it matters if you could eat and really have shelter. So it comes back to like God is supposed to be in your life because honestly it's all that it matters too, because life is God, because there's no other purpose that could ever go beyond that, you know.
Very good. Well said. Well said. I'm sorry, there was a hand up here, and then I just want to make sure that somebody had her hand up. Okay, go ahead. Behind me? I'm sorry.
Can I take it back to suffering? Why suffering exists? Like, I can't seem to wrap my head around why some people are born into disabilities. And there's different levels of it. Sometimes it's to the extent where a person cannot do anything or think for themselves. They're not able to do anything for themselves. They're relying on everybody else to do things for them. To the point where there's adults 20, 30, 40 and up that have the cognitive level of a toddler. I can't seem to understand why they would be born into that.
Right. Very good. Sometimes, and this is a very challenging question, and you would want to hear a satisfying answer, but my response to this is that there will never be a satisfying answer to you simply because you operate on a different playing field or level than God. You want to grasp and understand something that is not meant for you to understand. And the best example I give you, I'm not saying you shouldn't be asking that. The best example I give you is that if you read Job chapter 38, 39, 40, and 41, you will understand the answer to your question. Remember those chapters. Job 38, 39, 40, and 41. Why is that? Job had questions like that to God. And he had reasons to ask, by the way. Okay? He's not just, and you know what happened to him? He questioned God back and forth, and this, and this, and that. So God said, okay, Job, thank you. Are you done with your questions, my friend? Yes. Yes, I am done, God. Well then, let me lay down for you 64 questions. Do you have answers for them? That's 38, 39, 40, and 41. At the end of God questioning Job, these 64 questions, Job said, I am a foolish man. What was I thinking? And then he began to realize the foolishness of him even wanting to find answers for these questions. And then he said his famous saying at the end is that I have heard of you with my ears, and now my eyes had seen your presence. So these things that are happening to these people could be the channel through which God is making his presence known, but you don't know that. See? Read Job. Forgive me, there was, yes, you have a question.
You kind of just touched on it, but it's more about Shanita's, like just going off of Shanita's question.
Please.
Of people that are born into it, into the faith, and into just have like direct exposure to Christianity versus people that are not, and where it's not easy and they don't even know it actually.
Very good.
But then you kind of just touched on it when you said God shows himself in ways that we don't know, but I don't know if that's the full.
Let me share with you what Christ said to this question. He was asked a question similar to that. Or you can say, what about all these people that did not hear of Christianity? He was asked something similar. Would you want to know the answer? Okay. So 1 second. I think it's in Luke 13, but I want to make sure I get the... 1 second. Luke 13. Yes, okay. So Christ was asked this question. What about all those who've never heard of you? Something like that. He was asked a question. Would you want to know his answer? He was asked this. What about those who... Luke 13:22. And he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying. Then one said to him, Lord, are there few who are saved? Again, it's a question of who's going to go to heaven, who's not going to go to heaven. What about those who've never heard of you? What about those who've heard of you? Who is ultimately going to go to heaven and who is not? That's why we are not to ponder or to philosophize about, oh, he's going to go to heaven, oh, he's going to go to hell. We're not called to do that, and we're not here to put on the cap of judge and say who's going to, that's not our place. So God could have said, the question is, are there few who's going to go to hell and heaven? If you say, if the question says, are there few who are saved? So if Christ said, no, there are about 90% will be saved. So the disciples, okay, good. So at least the majority will be saved. We can relax a little. And if he said 10%, then wait a minute, we need to raise it up a notch because it's only few statistical number. But what did he say? He never answered the question by many or few or a little or more or anything like that. You know what he said? Strive to enter through the narrow gate. You know what that means? You know what Christ is saying? It's none of your business. That's what he's saying. It's none of your business. Who's going to go? What about those who lived in an island that didn't? Well, it's none of your business. This implies that you are more compassionate about them than he is, which is wrong. He actually died for them. He has more interest in their salvation over you. So why would you even question that? Just do what you are called, strive. And don't bother so much, I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying let's not bother ourselves so much with who's going and who's not going, and who hasn't heard and who heard. You see? Another question that you should ask, what have I done to those who haven't heard of Christ? That's the question that I should be asking myself. Rather than, where are they going? What have I done to them? And that's the question that will yield some fruit. You see? So Christ is teaching us not to bother with these statistical questions. Yes, sir.
Regarding the point of the question of suffering, I was watching Nick. I don't know his last name. Nick, the dude with no arms and legs. Yeah.
I hate to refer to him as such, but yeah, I know what you mean.
So he was talking about suffering, and he was saying that suffering is a result of sin. The reason why we suffer is because of sin, and it's more like, why do people? His parents were Christian ministers, and he was born into this. So he started asking God, why this? Why me? So in the end, it's more like if I'm an alcoholic. If I have a child, my child will tend to have a higher chance of being an alcoholic, which is basically the same thing. Sin is the cause of suffering, even though some people may not have did anything wrong, but because of sin, there is suffering.
Yes, it's the cause of suffering, but I think that's half the story. It's true, you're defining where suffering comes from, but that's half the truth. I think the other half of the truth is very important. I think you know what it is. Now, sin causes suffering, but then when you suffer now, suffering had taken a different definition. It has been transformed. It has become blessed, or it has become fellowship with Christ. Okay? And that's what St. Paul said. You know, the fellowship of his suffering. This is what he said. So Christ, here's the difference between Eastern mystics, like Buddhists, and Christianity. You know where suffering comes from? The gap between two things. Yes, it comes from sin, but suffering comes from a gap between two things. Desire and satisfaction. When you desire something that is not satisfied, suffering occurs. Okay? Desire and satisfaction. So what Eastern mystics or Buddhism try to do is to, okay, well, wait a minute. If I desire something that is not fulfilled and satisfied, I experience suffering. So for me to get rid of suffering, I need to get rid of desire. But that's not what Christianity did. Christianity left the desire and left the satisfaction and transformed suffering to become fellowship with Him who suffered for you. So you enter into fellowship with Christ through suffering. It had taken now suffering has taken a different shape and form. That's one thing. The other thing too, we can argue with a Buddhist. And the ultimate thing for a Buddhist is to eliminate desire, to eliminate suffering. But does that logically make sense? You cannot eliminate all desire, because for you to eliminate desire, you must desire to eliminate desire. See? So you cannot just logically say, I'm going to eliminate all my desires. So anyways, that's the value of suffering now is totally different than not the value. The concept of suffering now is totally different than it was before. And by the way, sorry, Abuna, if I say anything wrong, please correct me. Okay, please.
What about when it's easier to claim that some sort of dualism has to exist to justify the existence of evil and suffering? Because we're not even going to talk about the suffering that exists because of desire, and then when that desire isn't obtained, there's suffering, but like terminal illness or starvation or whatever else. So how would someone respond to that there has to be a source that evil is coming from?
Yeah, now you go to dualism, by the way, it's like the yin and yang, you know what I'm talking about, the yin and yang, and there's the God of evil and the God of good and all that. For you to understand the source of evil, you need to understand what evil is. What is evil? Just define evil. Very good. It's the absence of good. You want to be more accurate. It's not the absence of good. It's the loss of good. And there's a difference, and I'll tell you what's the difference. Evil is the loss of, what's the difference between loss and absence? If I look at this wall and I say, this wall does not have eyes. Well, yeah, it's absent of eyes. But if I look at a blind man, I say, this man has lost his sight. It's a loss. What does that mean? This wall was not designed to have eyes. It's absent. This man was designed to have eyes and lost it. That's evil. Evil is the loss of good. Do you see the difference now? So you're designed to have goodness, and you lost that design, or you lost that goodness rather, and that loss becomes evil. Evil is not something that has any ontological properties, any properties. It doesn't have any essence. Evil is not something you turn to. You are created for good, and God is good. Turning away from God is evil, but you're not turning to something. Like evil doesn't have any substance. You see? Define to me dishonesty. The lack of honesty. What is sin? Is sin something you do? No. Sin is something you don't do. That's the true definition of sin. When you cheat, when you lie, you're actually not telling the truth. When you hate, you're not loving. So if you want to have the true definition of sin, sin is something you don't do. It's not something that you do. Do you see my thing? The negative, or the loss of goodness. So with that definition, you don't have the God of evil and the God of good. You have the God of good. Turning away your back to Him is evil. That's the essence of evil. And Saint Irenaeus, Saint Justin Martyr talked about these two saints extensively, the definition of evil.
How do you get darkness?
Loss of light.
Loss of light.
Perfect example. Thank you. Perfect example. Okay, there's another thing I wanted to say about the problem of evil. معلش يعني one more point and then we'll go on to another question. I just think it's an important question to discuss. Who's asking the question? There's so much evil in this world. Who's asking the question? Who is legitimately is asking this question? To the naturalist, what's evil? What's evil to the naturalist? Actually, the evil has a problem to ask the question. I mean, the evil. The naturalist or the atheist has a question of evil. To ask the question of evil. Do you know why? When you imply there's such a thing as evil, you're implying that there's such a thing as what? As good. If I tell you that this device or iPad is old, I imply that I have an idea of what a new one looks like. Or else, how do I know this is old? So if I say there's such a thing as evil, I am implying that I know what is good. And if I say something is good, I am also implying that there's a standard, moral standard, upon which I know, or against which I can differentiate between good and evil. And if I say that there's a moral standard and moral law, I am implying a moral law giver who I'm trying to actually disprove, not prove. So by just raising the question of evil, you're proving that God exists. Because if God doesn't exist, then evil would not have any ontological substance. Do you see? So that's one thing that we ought to keep in mind. Another point is that you have atheists and non-believers asking this question of evil. But then I have a question. When you're rejecting my answer for the problem of evil, I think you ought to be able to provide a more satisfying answer. So here's the question I ask. What is your answer as a non-believer to the problem of evil? Do you provide a better explanation? Do they? Because you nodded.
I would say that the devil's given some sort of power, and because he's given this sort of power, it exists. And I know that creates a bit of a dualism. That's why I was asking you.
Yeah. Once again, I mean, you can trace that back. Once again, how did Satan fall? By turning away from God. So again, the case for dualism doesn't stand. Because it goes back to the loss of goodness. But the non-believer ought to have a better explanation for the problem. As a matter of fact, it's much more depressing for a non-believer than it is for the believer. At least I have an answer. I can understand what I know that evil is fellowship with the suffering of our Lord. I know that after evil and suffering, there is some kind of a place or heaven that has no suffering and no tears and all that. What's the answer for the non-believer?
So the original question was, why is there pain and suffering? And from what I was told before, theologians say that we lost or we fall short of the glory of God and the grace of God ever since the Garden of Eden, when the original sin happened. And actually the first sin was disobedience from God. And the Greek word of sin is missing the mark, and it's literally, like you said, they turned away from God. It was disobedience, and ever since then, death has entered. So we lost the cloak of God's glory, and ever since then, we've been a fallen people trying to reconcile with God. So, but another thing is a lot of people tend to have a misconception of what suffering is. They attribute evil to suffering. Meanwhile, like you said, suffering has been re-innovated, reinvented. It's not transformed completely, metamorphosis. But the thing is this, and I thought about this, and I had a discussion with my sister and a few others. I thought like, well, first of all, in Proverbs, I just pulled it up, Proverbs 3, verse 11, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction, for whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights. So in order for us to grow, there needs to be adversity. And we all have our different trials and tribulations, whether it's me having a terminal illness, whether it's me having a desire for something that I can never achieve, worldly material. And people have to understand one thing, that suffering is not necessarily all evil. It's chastisement, you know, it's renewal. Anything that goes through adversity or brass through the fire, it shines. That's how we grow. And then the discussion I was having with my sister, I said, you know what, there's people who are paraplegics, who have so many issues. And I'm like, oh, I can't even imagine being in pain for 10 minutes, let alone 70 years or 75 years of life expectancy. But I said, you know what? Overall, the bigger picture, if I'm in 1,000 years of agony, what does that compare to an infinite lifetime of glory? It's nothing. So in essence, I mean, are we really suffering? Is it actual suffering? Or is it just growth through this physical life?
Very, very well said. Well said. And this is echoed, or you echoed St. Paul when he said that the sufferings of this age do not compare to the glory that's going to be revealed in us in the age to come. Absolutely. Well said. What's your name again? Minardus? Great point. Great point. This reminded me of something, how suffering, to build on your point, how suffering is actually good for us and we don't know it. I was taking my son to get his vaccination when he was little child. And then here I am, his father, who's supposed to love him and don't want to inflict any harm upon him. And I hand him willingly to this very strange man wearing all these strange things on his head. And this strange man pulls a needle and he's about to stab my son. And my son is looking at me, what are you doing? I'm supposed to be your son. You're supposed to love me. What are you doing? And I tell him, it's because I love you that I'm letting you undergo this vaccination. That's what God does to us. And we kick and scream. But he says, son, you don't know. I know. Illustrations help bring abstract ideas into real life. Any other comments on evil before we go on to the other? Okay, I think evil is going to probably take over. We show you the. Okay.
I was thinking of something. What if the naturalistic point of view of evil would be, and it actually relatively connects to Christianity, because a person who's atheist, he would say that evil is about the desires of humankind of money, or whether it's corruption inside humans, which it legitimately is sin. Basically, not saying it in the form of representing Christianity, but it is sin. The fact that humans want to do a desire rather than pursuing other people, loving others, loving themselves more than anyone else. I think it's very similar, but they don't understand that because they don't want to clearly open their eyes to the fact that they're insane.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why they continue to experience this evil and suffering in their lives. Very well said. I think there were a couple of other hands. Yes. Different topic. Any topic before we. Any other comments or questions on evil? Yes. Yeah, we'll get to that different topic in a second. Oh, you don't understand. Forgive me.
God is a king. He has first power and the largest power. Evil is against the king. He has some power, but not as powerful as God. So someone follow evil. They think, oh, he has money, he has power, I follow him. But they don't think who is faithful and who is the truth and who is the first source in the world.
Who is God? Who is God? Very good. Very good. So, thank you for this point. Any other not evil questions, but I mean, any evil questions? Yes, Mariam. But hold on, before you ask, if you would wait until... One for each hand.
All right.
It's just a comment, not a question, about the idea of suffering and where it comes to illness. And it's not necessarily to convince an atheist, but it's just something for us to keep in mind. A lot of us, when we complain or when we have an issue with suffering, we're not the ones suffering, and we forget perspective. The perspective of the person who's undergoing the suffering. It could be of gratitude. It could be this is their wake-up call. An illness could be a wake-up call to say, you're dying soon, come back to me. And without that illness, they may never go to heaven. Or it could be the time, that they get to see God. With the three saintly youths, they saw God in the fiery furnace. It wasn't when they were taking care of the city. It wasn't, when they were being offered gifts. It was in the fiery furnace. And oftentimes we forget that. And I think because we forget that if we are going through the suffering ourselves, we have a choice. We have a choice to embrace it and look for God in the situation or what His purpose is, or we have a choice to reject Him, in which case we go through the suffering and not get the benefit or the blessing of it. So.
Sweet. Very, very well said. Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Mariam. Can I give you another story or analogy about suffering, and then we'll move on to the next point. Imagine in your house, in your living room, beautifully decorated living room, you have an old wooden telescope that is just sitting there in the middle of your living room. It's old and it just doesn't look good, and it's an eyesore in your beautifully decorated living room. Now, every time you walk in your living room, you look at this telescope and you're, it's ugly. I don't like to see it because it just doesn't fit. And every time you do this, you get frustrated. But have you ever thought once that this telescope is not for you to look at it, it's for you to look through it? And only when you look through it, you can see the glory and the splendor of God and His creation. Oftentimes, we look at suffering, not through suffering. And this is what suffering is for. It's a gift from God. This telescope actually is very useful and powerful only if we look alongside it, through it, to realize the glories, not at it and realize its ugliness. Does that make sense? Okay.
So before we were talking about how in order for there to be other gods, one had to create another. That's what you explained in. Yeah. So, you said there couldn't possibly be more than one God, because if there were four gods, one would have to create the next, and the next would have to create another, and it would just be not ending, for example. Yeah. Sorry, is that correct?
To an extent, yes.
Okay. So why can't, just the way our God exists, just He was there from the beginning, why couldn't that be true? Why do other gods need to be created while ours just exists?
Okay. Then, good question. You and I need to, again, I mentioned that a few times, we need to have a common definition of what you and I mean by God. That's it. What do you mean by God in your question? The ultimate deity. Meaning, as far as his omnipresence, as far as his eternality, what do I mean or do you mean by God? He is the what? Eternal, omnipresent, necessarily existing, the first cause. All of these are attributes of the God that we are discussing. By default, there could not be any other God. By definition, God is the first ultimate cause, by definition, of what we mean by God. So you cannot say there is a God and another God, because that renders the first God not the first cause, because there's another God that actually became the first cause, another God that became the first cause, and that's logically impossible. So by definition, there's only one God. Okay? So that's the monotheistic explanation versus the polytheistic view. I'm not going to give you verses from the scriptures, but there are several verses. Hear, O Israel, your God is one. That's the very first اسمها الشيمة اللي هي يعني زي اسمع شيمة يعني اسمع زي جاي من صموئيل اللي هي زي ما تقول يعني القانون بتاع الجوز Pledge of Allegiance for the Jews. Hear, O Israel, your God is one. The very first thing, there's only one God. We have already established that definition, there's only one God. Did you have your hand?
Couldn't you also use something like Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is to be preferred, that why multiply explanations in terms of gods, like having more than one God? Then maybe you could also say something like the property of God is that anything that would be God would be unified, because one of the things that makes him perfect is the fact that everything is done, whatever that substance is, God stuff, implies that if anything else is of that substance, the homoousia, then that would be God. The fact that there are persons within that substance is a totally different matter that can come from special revelation rather than general revelation.
Excellent point. Yes. Did you guys get that? Did you guys, can you repeat it in simpler terms?
I mean, if we think about God, whatever the stuff God is made of, one of the things we say about God is perfect. He's the greatest being we can conceive of. But one of the things about being the greatest being is that you have certain properties or things about the stuff you're made of. And one of them might be something like unity, or whatever that is, whatever that infinite thing is, you might say that's God. So to have more than one set of those stuffs would not have the unity, if that makes sense. And the other thing is there's a guy, there's a phrase called the simplest explanations to be preferred. That is to say, if my car breaks down and I happen not to put oil in it, it might not be a demon that did it, it might be that I didn't put oil in it. And the same thing with God, like why multiply gods if you can get the explanation from one? So that may not necessarily prove one God, but it is to say it is to be preferred over the others. Occam's razor.
Very good. Very good. And sometimes we should be happy that God provided one way, and if he did provide 100 ways, we would still want to have 101 ways. But we should be happy that at least there is one way. Other questions? Because there's one of the questions that you guys mentioned, besides the problem of evil, questions on the scriptures. How can I prove that this book we call the Bible is authentic, or is valid, or is reliable and divinely inspired? So you guys help me answer this question. How do you know the Bible is? Okay, I think that's a good idea. Thank you for having mercy on us. Yes, but prepare for this question, this discussion tomorrow. 1 second. Oh.
Just a quick question. Is it fair to assert that evil now is existent only because our own will exists, because free will exists? It's true. Because I also had another discussion with someone where it's like, it's in logical terms, if God is life, and any deviance from that life, we begin to decay. And that's why I think people have a misconception of sin and its consequences. People think like God is trying to punish us. I mean, there is reproof by God, but I also think that because of his nature and his essence and the way we were built, it's like if you were to unplug someone from a power source, they would slowly decay. So it's more so of a natural consequence, not because God is trying to, a retribution. So, yeah.
Theologically sound. And if I were to recommend for you one book to read, and I think every single one should read this book, it's by Saint Athanasius on the Incarnation, speaks to. Yes, it's translated into Arabic. Tagassud al-Kalima. It's an excellent book. I encourage all of you to read it, and it speaks to these points as well. Okay, one last comment, and then we'll end. Go ahead.
Actually, maybe it's a continuation to my earlier question. What is the difference between free will?
We can't hear you.
What is the difference between free will when Adam and Eve fell and our free will now? We both, at both times we had free will, right? But is there any difference?
There's no difference.
Are we?
We fall the same way they do, and by the same devices they fell through. Until today. Satan has the same devices that he used from then until now. Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful edifying to me. Thank you. This was very beneficial to me, very, very much so, and I'm not just saying that. This was something that I treasure, and I'll take home a lot of learnings from you. And I hope to see you all tomorrow in the liturgy and thereafter. And one thing I would ask of you is to please remember this ministry in your prayers. And it was, again, a privilege and a blessing to be with you all, and we'll see you tomorrow, God willing.